Hey, welcome to the Influency Podcast. I'm your host, Hadar, and this is episode number 333. In this episode, I'm going to share with you a conversation I had with Chris and Nick, two English teachers, about culture, identity, and language. We recorded this episode in 2020, and I thought it would be a good idea to bring this conversation back and share it with you here on this podcast. I hope you enjoy it. Hi, Chris.
Hey.
Hi, Nick.
Hey.
Hey. So good to have you here today with us.
So great to be here. I'm super excited.
Okay, Nick and Chris. So if people, for some reason, don't know you guys, then why don't you just, Chris, let's begin with you. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself, who you are, what you do, who you serve, who you help, where you live, how your day has been like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So my name is Chris. I am an ESL teacher. I work 100% online. I guess everyone works like pretty much online nowadays. But I live in Nashville, Tennessee, in the United States. I've been teaching English for almost 5 years now. I can't really believe it, but I work with a lot of people who are working on pronunciation stuff and just working on their communication skills, whether it's like at work or with their family members and things like that. Yeah, it's what I love to do.
Amazing. And like, I love your pronunciation videos, because I think they're so detailed. It's just like how I love to teach, deep in the details, but also having like a broader understanding of what the sound is. So I love that.
So happy. Thank you.
Yeah. And you have a YouTube channel and an Instagram account, right? If you want to follow these guys, and you should, then you can go to Language with Chris on Instagram and ESL Teacher Nick on Instagram as well. Yelena says, I love your pronunciation videos.
Thank
Chris.
you, Yelena.
Okay.
So sweet.
All right, Nick.
Hey, everyone. So my name is Nick. I am from Toronto, Canada. I am a primary, junior, intermediate teacher. I've been doing it for about 5 or 6 years. And I'm also an ESL teacher. I work with adults. I've been doing that for about 1 year.
Have you been doing it on your own or in a language school?
I've been doing it on my own. Mostly tutoring. Yeah.
And how's the COVID situation over there? Do you actually teach in the classroom these days, or do you teach remotely?
Well, school has just started. It just started actually this week. It started. So I am this year I am just supply teaching or occasional teaching. So I want to kind of just see how things go, if there are any more outbreaks or cases of COVID before I kind of make that decision to go back into the classroom. So for now, I'm just teaching online, doing one-on-one tutoring, that sort of thing.
Lovely.
Yeah.
Okay, you guys. So I wanted to begin this conversation by talking about, first of all, talking about what it's like for someone, especially for immigrants, to move from one country to another. A lot of the people watching this, because this is, we basically talk about language and how to feel comfortable in English. So, of course, there is a need if you don't live in an English-speaking country, if you still live in your country and you just want to improve your English. But when it comes to speaking another language, that means that you are getting in touch with another culture, right? So whether you work in a global company that requires you to interact with people from a different culture, and you use English to do that, whether it's, American, British, Australian, or European, or whatever, I'm generalizing, right? But English is a tool to connect with different cultures. So ultimately, all of you here, all of the people watching this, they must have had that experience of interacting with different cultures, but also probably, if you've immigrated, then the experience of moving into a new culture and a new society. And that, in addition to mastering a language or feeling comfortable in a new language, it has a lot of implications on people's lives and sense of identity and decisions that they make in their lives, right? I know a lot of immigrants that decided to no longer speak in their native language with their kids because they wanted them to immerse in the culture. So we're going to talk about what happens when we have an interaction of two different cultures. Let's talk about the US or Canada, because both, like, this is where you guys are coming from. I'm going to talk about my experience as a foreigner, because that's how I used to call myself, living in the US when I lived there for 5 years. And yeah, so first of all, anything else that you'd like to point out before we begin?
I think it's important for me to let everybody know that I'm originally from the US, and like everything that I say is like from kind of the point of view of an outsider trying to understand how my students feel. I've never actually lived in another country. I've been to a few other countries, but everything is like me trying to understand things as an outsider. And I'm still like every day I'm trying to like, every day is like a new YouTube like documentary about like multiculturalism or native speakerism and stuff like that. So I'm still learning. That's what I want everyone to know.
Exactly. I'd agree with Chris as well too. Like, I've only lived in Canada, so this is my perspective. My perspective might be biased or a little different from someone else's. So yeah, I think it's important to just make that clear as well.
Absolutely. And thank you for mentioning that, because I don't take it for granted. A lot of people don't recognize that what they're saying is not the ultimate truth or fact. It's just a perspective, and it is based on your experience, your life, like the prism that you've, lived your life through. So, okay. So let's begin by first defining some ideas, right? Like, and we're mainly going to talk about cultural pluralism, right? And how that relates to language. So, what is cultural pluralism?
Nick, you got this.
Go for it, Nick.
Okay, so cultural pluralism for me is basically this idea of when you have smaller groups within a larger society where there might be a dominant culture, where they basically are able to maintain their own cultural identities, their own values, their own practices. Usually they're accepted by the dominant society, provided that that elements or parts of their culture are consistent with the laws and values of the wider society. So that for me is really what cultural pluralism is. It's pretty much this idea of integration. You can practice your own culture, but as long as you sort of conform to a certain extent to the dominant culture.
Okay. And you use the word integration, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So it's integration. If we're talking about cultural pluralism, which is, something that probably we want to strive for, maybe not everyone. And we're going to talk about immigrants. And I can tell you from my own personal experience that I did not want integration when I lived in the US. I wanted full-on assimilation, right? I was 20. I moved to the US. This is why I sound like I sound, because I wanted to lose the identity that I had, which is of a non-American, right? An Israeli. And I changed my name. So a lot of times we look at integration and assimilation. Okay, so what is the difference, Nick or Chris? Chris, what is the difference between integration and assimilation? So Nick said cultural pluralism is this idea of integration, that we live together, right? We respect each other's culture. And there is, of course, the dominant culture, but no one is interfering with how people live their lives. Sort of, right? Nick, do you want to add anything? Well, you did.
Yeah, that sounds pretty much.
Yeah,
right.
Simplified.
Yeah.
Simplified. I like simplifying things. But there is this idea, like I suggested, I did not want integration, I wanted assimilation. So what is the difference, Chris, between the two?
So I remember the first time Nick and I were talking about this topic, I had no idea what cultural pluralism was. I had to like Google it, and I was like, okay, should I just pretend like I know? Because I had no idea. So for everybody who's watching, if you don't know, don't worry. I looked
exactly,
and I was like,
love it.
Wait, you know what? This reminds me so much of, I'm sure that many people have heard about how the United States is the melting pot this melting pot idea is this assimilation. And I think that it's kind of like a soup versus a salad. When you're in a soup, you just kind of want everything to boil and melt together so that everything can kind of look the same. But this integration is more of like a salad where you can identify and still see the original properties of the vegetables, I guess.
I love this imagery, like of a salad versus a soup that you cook and it all tastes the same. Doesn't matter like what vegetables were there. But then it could be like a tossed salad, right? Like, or it's mainly lettuce, but there are like some tomatoes, a little bit of carrot, so you see it, you taste it, but it's ultimately, when you look at it from afar, it looks green. So you assume it's there's lettuce there. That's like the main culture. I love that. Okay, so assimilation is really losing your original identity. That's not losing, but like kind of like washing it out, right?
Yeah, washing it out or hiding it, trying to take on the characteristics of that dominant society so that you don't seem different.
Right. Why is that? Like, why do you think there is this big fear of being different? I mean, we might think that like that answer is obvious, but let's dig deep and see, because ultimately, we will bring it back to English because it really is. English is a sheer reflection because people recognize you the moment you open your mouth, right? Let's say you changed your outfits, maybe like you have a slightly different look, but still the moment you open your mouth, people can recognize you. People can point out and say, you're from here, you're from there. And they think it's all nice and fun, but they're signaling you out that you're different than me, right? And that creates resistance. So ultimately, I really think that the language has a huge part in this conversation. So Chris, or Nick, Chris, you have a couple more minutes to think. Nick, you go first. Why do you think people are so afraid of that, like have that fear?
Well, I think the fear, it comes from the fact that if people are able to practice all of their cultures or identities, then it's going to be a threat, almost a threat to like a national identity. I feel like English is like the basis in which it's part of a national identity. It's certainly if we're talking about America or Canada. Yeah, so I really think that there's this fear that if too many people are able to practice their cultures, their religions, or speak their various languages, that somehow the national identity of the dominant culture is going to be lost.
Yeah. So that is the fear that is experienced by the dominant society, right? And I absolutely agree with you. And I have a really good example that I just came across in a book that I'm going to share in a sec. But Chris, what about the fear, on the other hand, like the fear of being different in the people from those subcultures?
Oh, gosh, I feel like there's such a fear of this. Like several years ago, I visited Colombia for the first time. And if I didn't say anything, nobody would know that I was American. But as soon as I started speaking, people were like, oh, where are you from? And I'm like, oh, my God, this person is totally going to treat me differently because I'm from the United States. Are they going to charge me differently? Are they going to take me to the wrong place if I'm in a taxi? What thoughts are they going to impose on me because of the things that they've heard in the media or throughout history or from their family?
Right.
Like that.
Right.
People impose so much of that on when they just know that you're not from the same place.
Right. Like there are so many stereotypes that people have, right? Hold about Americans, Canadians, Israelis, Russian, Japanese, right? Like we have all of these. And then we look for them the moment we come across, like if you say that you're American, it's like, oh, so you are this and that, right? Like you speak loudly, you eat junk food, you do this, you do that. We all know like the list of stereotypes that for each culture. Yeah, absolutely. And so you want to move away from it.
Yeah. You don't want to be feared and you don't want to be that villain that people portray you as in movies. Gosh, I've had so many students who have just been like, oh, okay, well, do you do this? Because in all the movies I see that Black people do this, or that Americans do this, or that the gay characters do this. And I'm like,
So you have like triple roles here, right? You have 3 different levels, as a Black person, right? As an American, people already judge you without knowing you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Oh gosh, it's so annoying. And I know that it's got to be so annoying for my students and for like any immigrant of any country, like all those assumptions that come with that.
Yeah. Like one of the stereotypes of Israelis is that we're rude. So one of the ways that I was trying to navigate through, like living in the US, was to be overly polite.
Oh my God.
And kind and compassionate and pleasing. Just that, God forbid, I won't be perceived as rude, right? So I was overdoing everything that is against the stereotypical, Israeli. So I won't be seen as one. So it's really interesting. And we do it. I know that now, right? Like years after, but when I was doing it, I didn't think that that's what I was doing. I only realized it after I moved back to Israel, and I was like, I didn't know how to handle myself after 5 years in the US. Culturally, I was just like this odd, bizarre person, like being surprised about people's behavior. Right now, I'm totally back home. Yeah, it's really interesting. So let's see if we have any questions. You guys, do you have any questions for us before I move on, like to talk about language and identity? So that when people started immigrating to the U.S., or I think right after the independence, the Declaration of Independence, I read in a book that people were teaching in German, their kids, and they were prosecuted for it. Right? Some of the citizens were teaching in German, and they said that if they still use their language and not English, right, German, then it's going to make them less patriotic. I'm totally paraphrasing here, but that was the idea, right? So they weren't allowed to use any other language but English because they were afraid it's going to jeopardize or to change their mind about, being a patriot. So it's exactly, Nick, what you said about that fear and I can also share with you, I live in Israel and we have a very complex identity because of the conflict between Arabs and Israelis. And so Hebrew is the dominant language, but Arabic, right? Like it has become political how much you use Arabic. Now, to my opinion, Arabic should be taught in schools because, we have a lot of Arab Israeli citizens and it's ridiculous that we don't speak the language, right? That's not the language that we're taught in school. You can choose between Arabic and French, and I learned Arabic and it wasn't even it was literary Arabic. So no one really speaks that, right? So it was just for me to be able to read books or whatever. And I can see that the bigger the conflict is, Arabic loses its place more and more, right? Like on street posts, in schools, right? Like it's not like an official language anymore, which is crazy to think about it. So language is being used to see how cultures are positioned in the society. So language is really very much connected to this whole discussion. Let's see what are the someone was asking a really good question with it. Okay. What is a national identity anyway?
Interesting. What is a national identity?
And Nick, do you want to take a stab at it? Do you have any?
I think Nick and I were talking about this or the day before yesterday a little bit. Remember when we were talking about the difference between nationality and ethnicity?
You're talking about race and ethnicity.
Race and ethnicity, right? Yeah. So
we can bring national identity to the party here. So
yeah, why not?
Let's talk about it. Actually, let's talk about the difference between the three: national identity, race, and ethnicity. I think it's so popular to use these that if we think about it, a lot of people don't even know what that means anymore, right? Okay, so how did you guys define it in that conversation?
I always have trouble defining like ethnicity versus race, but when we were talking about it, I was saying like, okay, remember the conflict between the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda, I believe it was Rwanda. Depending on like the wars that were being fought, you might be on one side of the border or the other side of the border, depending on how they split up the country. But at the end of the day, you're still going to come from this lineage of a people group. For me, that lineage is more of an ethnicity. But I have not.
It's okay, no, because I added some stuff. So I added the conversation about ethnicity and race and this national identity.
Nick, what do you think?
Well, when we were talking about race and ethnicity, Chris, we were both kind of like in disagreement, because we were in disagreement, but we also agreed on certain things. So it was interesting. For me, race is like your biological characteristics or your traits, like your skin color, or maybe your hair, your eye color, your features, your physical features. Where ethnicity, I feel like ethnicity is more about your language and more of the culture, the more cultural elements, the way that you think about certain things, physically, how you might present yourself. So I feel like they're very similar. They're very related, especially in how they are encoded within culture. And I feel like a lot of times people use race to sort of try and identify, okay, you're part of my group. You know, I look at you, you look sort of like me. So we're one and the same. But at the same time, there are also differences. Clearly, there are differences between people who might look similar, but they're of a different culture. So I think they're related, but they're also different as well, too.
I think that a lot of the time when we were also talking about how a lot of the time we will see other people here in the United States or in North America in general. And if we see someone who doesn't look like us, or someone and we can't like identify them or put them in this box, so many people, I've done this too before, where people will just be like, what are you? That question is so problematic. Like, what are you? It's just so like kind of dehumanizing.
Like a human?
Yeah. Like,
how do you even answer that? Yeah.
Right. So people want to know so that they can put you in this box and then put those stereotypes onto you, those thoughts like, oh, okay, this person is originally from South Africa. Okay. All right. So South African people in my mind do this. All right. Now I think I know more about your family and what you do on a regular basis, etc. And yeah, that's that's so problematic. But it's something people do all the time. I catch myself doing it sometimes, and I'm
like you have to tell yourself a story, and you have to have answers in your brain. Like our brain always asks questions, right? When we are introduced, you want to know how close you are to the other person or not, like whether it's done consciously or subconsciously. So I think asking someone like, you have an accent, where you're from, or what are you? You know, where are you from in terms of country, like what country are you from, right? So for me, it's like I'm Middle Eastern, but I'm Israeli. It's very complicated. What is my national identity? Going back to national identity. So I'm Israeli. I associate that's what it says on my passport.
Right.
But also in Israel, we have several ethnicities, right? My parents were born in the Middle East. My dad is from Iraq and my mom is from Libya, right? So I see myself more as Middle Eastern in terms of my ethnicity, right? And I'm Jewish. So there are all these elements that are tied together, but I'm very different culturally, ethnically, also from other Jewish people living in Israel, sharing, same race, but different culture, different ethnicity within the same country. It could be even in the same city, it could be even in the same street as mine, right? So they're like, and we always, even now, when living in Israel, we always see that through that filter of, categorizing and putting people into boxes.
Yeah.
How do you identify, you guys, national identity? So you're Canadian, you're from the US. Is it something that makes you proud? Do you think about it?
I think that when most people think about the United States, they think of like people like holding American flags and like just running down the street shouting USA all the time. I'm not that kind of person. Like, I mean, if you get me a jacket with the American flag on it, I'll wear it. But I'm not the type of person who will be like, well, I'm American, so this is the right way to do things, or this is how I do stuff, or something like that. It's not. I mean, it is a part of my identity. I have to realize that this is part of my culture. I'm an American guy.
Mm-hmm.
I think like an American. I see things through an American lens. But at the same time, I don't want people to just reduce me to that. It's not like, I don't say like, hey, my name's Chris and I'm American. I just say like, hey, I'm Chris. I usually say what I do and what I like and who I talk to and what stuff like that, instead of my nationality first.
Yeah. For me, it's really interesting. So I'm biracial. My father is Greek and my mother is Bajan from Barbados. So I identify myself as biracial. I identify myself as Bajan, Greek, Canadian. I also identify myself as Black as well too. So I think it really depends. But you mentioned an interesting point, and I just wanted to talk about. I feel like race has been historically has determined your citizenship. It's determined what you're entitled to, especially in Canada and the United States. Race has definitely been like a factor that will influence what you're entitled to. And I feel like now, currently, we're sort of trying to do away with that idea of a race-based sort of system. But I feel like we kind of forget about its existence, and that it actually was. It was used to determine if someone was a citizen or not a citizen, or if someone was entitled to certain privileges, or if someone wasn't entitled to certain privileges. Right. And I think that is the root of a lot of the issues that we're seeing, where we have these problems in culturally pluralist societies where people can't seem to get along. There are all these issues happening, especially what we see now with Black Lives Matter. And we're seeing this. And I think we have to acknowledge that we come from a system. Our system is really rooted in a lot of racist sort of ideologies. And we kind of deny that. We need to have a lot more open conversations about it and sort of focus our attention on that.
I totally agree, Nick. So I remember the first time we were talking about this, we were talking about how, like, a lot of people will be like, oh, well, we're in a post-racial society and we don't really, race doesn't matter anymore. And then
post-racial?
Right. Post-racial society. And it's just like,
because race don't matter. Like, when you say race don't matter, it seems that you never experienced any racism ever, right? But it means you're white. Okay.
Pretty much. I think that so many people just are not paying attention and are just like, I see the American government a lot of the time as a vehicle to get you from one place to another in your career or your family or whatever it is. And that vehicle was made, let's say that it's made for somebody who is 175 centimeters tall or something like that. But for a person who is taller or shorter, who is still a person who still has the ability to drive and has a license and everything like that, if they do not have the ability to make those changes to the vehicle, or the settings, like making sure that the mirror is in the right place or something like that, they're more prone to getting in a car accident, or maybe the police will see them and think, oh, okay, they're driving weird. Why are they driving like that? Or something like that. All of this is just pretty much to say that
yes, exactly,
we are not treated the same way because people are looking
for hundreds and hundreds of years. Just to clarify, it's not like something that happened, in the last 30, 40 years or the recent administration. Yeah,
exactly. And people will look at us through this lens of everything's okay, just don't worry about it, it's fine. And it's like, no, I actually still have this stuff that I have to deal with. You may have kind of changed the streets, but I'm still in this car that doesn't make any sense for me.
Yeah.
Which is what you're describing can help us understand also the difference between equality and equity. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Well, I think for me, equity is really this idea that even though like certain people don't start off from the same point, some people, like if we look at the history of the United States of America, white people have been afforded more privileges, as I was talking about, that the race-based system where they've benefited from being white. So what has happened is that they're in a better position to maybe make decisions, or they have more opportunities that are afforded to them because of how history has sort of played itself out. And where people of color, they don't have those same opportunities, because of what has also happened throughout history. And so they're not at an equal starting point. And I think what Chris is trying to say, that some people need some accommodations to sort of get them to that place so that there is more equality. Well, equality can't be achieved without equity in the current system that we're living in now. In an ideal world, if history didn't play itself the way it did, maybe it might be possible. But currently, I don't think that's possible without equity. Some systems in place to ensure that equity can happen.
Right, because a lot of people expect, okay, because now according to the law, there is equality. So some people expect, okay, you have the same rights as I do. Why don't you, go ahead and make it out in the world, right? And it's like we have equal rights. But it's not fair, because if we look back, years and years and hundreds of years back, like we need equity to make sure that exactly what you said, we have equality. And I think that sometimes people who have privilege, they don't realize that because they only look at it from their own perspective.
It happens all the time. Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's so many people, like, I guess kind of going back to this thing that we were talking about before, that see this equity as kind of a threat. They're like, oh, well, this other person is going to receive more benefits or more attention from the government than I will. And what about me? I worked for what I have and things like that. But they don't take into account the historical ramifications of just everything that has happened to like, at least here in the United States, people are like, oh, well, I got a good job and I live in a nice neighborhood. Why can't you? And it's like, well, because for hundreds of years, like, all these terrible things happened. And just recently, I'm just now starting to be able to see what I can get to.
Right. And not even to mention, all the psychological barriers that happen for people. It's not even just the financial, social, like all of that, the situation. It's it's imposterism and not feeling good enough because you're never, you're always expected to overperform if you have to. I think minorities, marginalized communities, non-native speakers, women, people of color, like they usually have to work harder to prove that they deserve the things that they're getting. Or even if it's just for themselves, right? Because there is that feeling of not being enough. Do you guys ever, being in the ESL industry, we always talk here about native speakerism and racism. And do you feel that, have you ever experienced racism in the English learning industry as teachers, people talking, commenting, mentioning something that you felt had to do with who you are, how you look?
I feel like from my background, being a biracial person or Black person, I feel like when I look at Black culture, for example, and I see the influence that Black culture has had, if we look at hip hop, if we look at the entertainment industry, especially, and I feel like there are a lot of vocabulary that comes from the Black community that's often taken, appropriated, and then there hasn't been an acknowledgement of where it's come from. Yeah. So that to me,
I would ask you to define appropriated and appropriation, cultural appropriation, because if you use it, maybe.
Sure. So cultural appropriation, I mean, is when someone of another ethnic group or culture takes something from one culture and then uses it to sort of promote themselves, and there's no sort of acknowledgement of where it came from. And then I feel like there is a double standard, because oftentimes when people appropriate Black culture, so people who are non-Black, when they use parts of Black culture, they seem to sort of get this shine, or they get promoted from it. But if it was a Black person who was doing it, they wouldn't sort of get that same attention, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Right. Absolutely. And also, I think to appropriate even language, as you said, I think that you pay a price if you do that as a Black person, for example.
Yes,
right.
You're considered less professional, or right?
Less intelligent, less articulate. And then if someone who's non-Black would use the same language, it would be like hip, cool, right? Or any different, like, it's not going to have the same effect. And that needs to be acknowledged.
Yes.
100%.
Chris, have you ever experienced, do you want to talk about?
I went into the ESL industry, like, really, I was thinking about this so much. I was like, it's going to be hard for me to get a job. I'm Black. Like, they're going to think that my English is bad because of the way that I look, because of the things that they've seen in TV, because of the things that their teachers or parents have told them. And thankfully, I don't think I have experienced much of this. But at the same time, I realized that a lot of the time I normalize a lot of this stuff. Like, oh, well, it just happens. It is what it is. With a lot
you don't even acknowledge it as problematic or racist. Yeah,
exactly. And I think that a lot of my students, of course, they know that I'm Black. They know that I'm African American, and sometimes they'll bring up things like, well, that's not the right way to speak, or this is wrong, or something like that. I'm like, well, actually, in African American vernacular English, which a lot of people know as like Black English or Ebonics, it's totally fine, and it's a lot easier. You don't have to think about putting together all these like verbs and stuff. But like Nick said, it is seen as wrong, and if you speak like that in the classroom, people will think that you're less intelligent, and it's totally unfair. I'm always reminding my students, like, this is a different way of saying the same thing. You should learn what it means. You can use it if you want to, but at the same time, you have to keep in mind that if you use it that way, this is what people are probably going to think. So just be careful.
Right.
It's like a minefield. Yeah.
Right. And you learn how to operate and how to speak in different circumstances, even non-native speakers, right? Like if I were to speak to Americans right now, I would have a different, probably like a slightly different tone, voice, language, pronunciation in comparison to where I would speak to fellow Israelis, and I would just have to use a few words in English or say something. And I know most of them are Israeli speakers, or people who are non-native speakers. Sometimes, like, you understand where you're at, and then you choose how to show up and like what language to use, whether it's your dialect or your accent or the words that you choose, ultimately either to not look so different or to get what you want, right? Like sometimes we do it because it's smart, because, if you want to pass the interview, then you are going to sound like you know that your future potential employer might want you to sound, right? Mm-hmm. So you kind of like assume that and you already play into that. Let's talk for a second about that idea of speaking with an accent, right? Like if we go back to pluralism and integration versus assimilation, so the difference between speaking with an accent but communicating properly, and mistakes and all of that, but communicating properly in English versus that idea of assimilation, how does it come across in the language, right? In English teaching, what do we see?
I think that a lot of my students think that if you are not speaking like a native that it is wrong and that automatically you are less intelligent. You're not going to get the job. People are not going to want to talk to you. Your accent or your grammar is hurting the other people's ears, even though people can probably understand what they're talking about and what they want and what they need to get and things like that. I think,
right.
And I have to remind myself of this too, like it's okay to speak with an accent if I'm learning another language, because I'm from the United States. English is my first language. I'm not going to be able to say this thing in Russian exactly the same way that my Russian student is. And I just have to be okay with that. And the other people that I'm talking to, I feel like, personally, I feel like they have to give me some patience because I'm not, it's not my first language.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Nick?
I agree as well with Chris. I think it's definitely important to communicate to my students that, okay, well, this is the expectation when you are in Canada. This is what it sounds like to speak proper standard English. I can teach you the grammar structures. I can teach you the foundation of it. But at the same time, remember, the focus is on being comprehensible. And I always say that to my students. It's about being comprehensible. It's not about changing your accent or trying to sound like a native speaker. Of course, you need to learn the structure. You need to understand. You need to be able to understand a native speaker. And there are certain ways that native speakers might say things, so that you should be equipped with that knowledge. But like I said, at the end of the day, it's about being comprehensible. Everybody has an accent, right? Everyone has an accent, even if you are a native speaker, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Obviously, both of you are native speakers, right? And both of you have slightly different pronunciation, right? It's very nuanced, but that's it. That's it really is. It shows your history, where you're from, I think a lot of it has to do the need to sound like a native. It goes back to what we talked about at the beginning about, wanting to assimilate into a culture. So people are not afraid of you, right? They're not afraid that you're here to dismantle their culture.
Yeah.
So I think that's where it's coming from. And then you don't want and then the sound of your voice, which represents how different you are. So that's the first thing people want to fix, right? So they don't know. But it doesn't really change your identity because your identity is so rooted in you. And nothing against assimilation, right? Like if people feel, I've been there, I know what it's like. I know that life can be easier if there are less points of difference and more points of connection, like within the society that you live in. Because even though, we want pluralism and multiculturalism, in reality, in the interaction between people, we all know that people hold a lot of biases and there is discrimination and prejudice and all of that, right? So sometimes people just want to avoid that.
Yeah, this is where I really have to check my privilege, because I know that my students are gonna face these things all the time. They're gonna have people always asking them, "Where are you from? Where are you really from?" When they tell me
I'm from the US, yeah.
Yeah, I'm from Florida. Okay, but where are you really from? And it's just like, okay, oh my gosh, I don't want to have this conversation every time. I don't want to have issues when I'm trying to get a job. I don't want my spouse's parents to think that I'm a bad person because of the way that I speak or where I come from or something like that.
Right.
So I do have to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, well, I mean, I know how that feels. So I have to be empathetic with that. So yeah, it just depends on the person, I guess.
Yeah. Let's see some of the comments here. I think there was a really interesting discussion here, and see if we have a few more questions before we wrap up. Interesting. Dewey says, for me, in my place, cultural assimilation, integration, and adaptation are not only about people who immigrate from one country to another country. Oh, so I thought I read it. Right. So it's not only about people who immigrated. Right. Like sometimes there are different cultures within the same country, and that absolutely. I think that when we talk about people immigrating, we mostly talked about the idea of language, But even within the same country, there are people who speak different languages, right? In China, for example, like a huge country, you have several languages. It's not just Mandarin Chinese, even though it's the dominant language. And there is a difference between languages.
Just to respond to what that person said, yeah, I think this is totally true. I think that this can happen like inside of a country where everyone is like a native of that country. Like it happens all the time, like between, I don't know, the West Coast and the East Coast, or somebody from New York, something like that. Like when a New Yorker comes down south or something like that, it's like, okay, well, you need to be a little bit more polite with people. And what do I mean by polite? I mean that you can't do this, and you need to talk slower, and you need to do this and that, when they could maintain their identity, and I would still understand what they are saying, probably.
Right.
So I do think that that's important to keep in mind.
Even like within boroughs, in New York, someone from Queens and Manhattan and the Bronx and Brooklyn, there's already, people that identify differently. And also different accents, right? So the moment you can put the stamp of like, yeah, you sound different too, then
yeah. How much is this taxi ride gonna be?
Yeah, right. How much is the taxi ride is going to be? Fatma says, I totally understand this because I have always lived with discrimination because of my disability. Right. We haven't talked about being able-bodied, right, as a privileged versus someone with a disability. Look differently. Many times I received the feeling of not belonging. Right.
Yeah.
Do you want to?
So like, I'm still trying to learn about like all these different isms. There's so many. So this is ableism, I'm understanding. And it's just trying to understand how a person is literally just trying to live their life, and how they have to conform to like places with a bunch of stairs if they're in a wheelchair or something like that, or if a blind person,
right,
or just certain things that I never had to deal with, and I don't consider their way of living. So I got to keep that stuff in mind.
Definitely. Accessibility, and I think that even when we're in the classroom and we're teaching, it's really important when we're trying to create an inclusive classroom as teachers. It's really important for us to sort of check our biases and our own assumptions about what we just think would be normal. So like Chris was saying about whether or not, okay, if my student has a disability, would they even be able to access the building, or would they be able to access the space, or would they be able to engage in this exercise if there is a lot of movement, for example, that is required in the classroom? So I think as teachers, it's really important for us to always check our biases and our assumptions based on our own personal identity.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I love that. I think that as teachers, we have a lot of responsibility, and many of the things that we talked about, even pluralism, and making people comfortable with, or students comfortable, especially kids, kids who are learning. If you live in a place, I'm assuming Canada is a place like in the classroom, right, Nick, where you live or where you teach, do you feel that there is diversity of different cultures? And
oh yeah, absolutely. Like Toronto, I live in Toronto, Canada, so I mean it's one of the most multicultural cities on the planet. So definitely I feel like there's a lot of diversity, and within the institutions I feel like things are starting to change. I'm seeing changes. I'm seeing that there are more accountability measures to ensure that that different groups are being recognized in the classroom, and that there are accommodations that are in place, and I think that that's what we need to see more of. So I'm optimistic, and I think also teachers really need to do a lot of their own personal work as well too. Like you have to have that motivation to be able to say, I want to research about this issue. I want to know more about this group. so that I can educate myself, basically. Like there needs to be that, and there needs to be on the part of the dominant institutions where they really need to recognize different groups and the diversity and ensure that measures that are inclusive of those groups of people.
Absolutely. And I think that instead of expecting them to understand you, especially as a teacher, it is so incredibly important to know who you're speaking with, where they're coming from, to understand more that cultural difference, and to be able to understand also how your behavior may be perceived as this or that, or, understand where they're coming from, when they don't understand something, or they ask certain questions, because it's really not just about the language. It's also very cultural. I always joke about teaching English in Israel. I say, well, there is like learning English and there is learning American, which is two different languages, right? Like you can take your thoughts and translate it to English, and so you won't be understood, or it might sound too direct or offensive if you don't use the right language, right? Vocal verbs or all of those. Okay, any final thoughts or anything else you want to leave our audience with, you guys?
I want to encourage everybody to do your research on a people group that you don't know very much about. Like learn about their struggles, learn about the history of their country and their culture and things like that, and learn how their culture and their history is similar or different from yours. Because I don't know, if you don't do that, it makes it really, really hard to be empathetic. I think that's one of the best ways to be empathetic. Just learn something that you don't know about somebody else.
Yeah. And be empathetic.
Yeah, empathy, definitely.
That's important.
Empathy with action, right?
Yeah.
So you can be empathetic, that's great, but make an action towards that.
Somebody out for being racist or ableist or sexist, and like make opportunities for people who are parts of those groups that are not in the majority. I always encourage my students to like, hey, look, if you hear me saying something that sounds racist or sexist or anything like that, call me out so we can have that conversation, because apparently I didn't get it. So I'm always telling them to do that. Please, let's have that conversation. They're probably tired of it by now.
But even asking the question or saying that is what matters, right? Like that is taking action, because they will pay attention to what you're saying. And when they speak to other people, they will pay attention to what they're saying, whether or not they say the same thing or not. Like they say, let me know if I say something offensive, but it's going to be in their awareness, which is why it's important to say that, why we're having this conversation, and also for people to know that they deserve better if they don't feel that they're being treated properly or equally. And sometimes they're like, yeah, well, I don't deserve it because I'm not part of the dominant society. But no, it's not. That's not how it works. So it's okay for you to be a little different living in a certain place.
Absolutely. Let's start encouraging these hard I think a lot of people that come here to the United States or that start learning English think, okay, well, I can't talk about politics and religion and anything that is.
That's what they teach you online, like small talk, no politics, no religion, no everything. That's it. No one talks about it anymore.
Right. And I understand that to a certain extent, but I feel like that holds us back from so much conversation that would help us to move forward. I'm always like, hey, look, if there's a difficult conversation, let's have it, please. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty. Like I get bored talking about the weather all the time. Like I don't care. Like the sun is still out there. Okay, but
or for baseball, Oh
my God, no.
Nick, would you like to add something?
Yeah. I mean, I think that I agree with what both of you are saying. And being open to hearing what other people have to say and their opinions. Like just be open-minded when you're hearing about a different perspective, or you're viewing or reading something that's from a different culture from yours. Just be open and try not to go to that place of judgment. And also, I think if you're in an institution, you're studying somewhere, I think that we need to have more of these conversations, and we need to bring more of like courses that focus on talking about like diversity and inclusive curriculum. I feel like often we focus on like the dominant forms of knowledge like science and mathematics and business. But let's start getting some more of these courses. So students start requesting
gender studies. Yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
Please. I wish I
gender
had
studies, looking at sexuality. Just let's learn some new things. Let's change the narrative.
Yeah, and like self-educate yourself, because these are things that are really essential for you as a human being, right? And sometimes the people who decide what you should learn, probably it doesn't serve them, or it wasn't, it's like years and years of the same curriculum. So you're absolutely right. And even in the English language industry, to encourage teachers to talk about, political issues and cultural issues, because I think it really helps students have that critical thinking and also developing that sense of identity that is so important.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. All right, you guys, thank you so much for being here with us. So Chris and Nick, you guys go follow them on Instagram. Chris also has a YouTube channel called Chris the English Teacher.
Chris the English Teacher. It's youtube.com/language with Chris. So it's
right. So it's the same handle. Okay. Beautiful. Thank you, Chris and Nick. And I'll see you soon.
Thank you. Thanks.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much.